great idea because it filled a very important gap that existed here, a gap that exists in the UK. It was filled in the UK by the British Art Metal Society. And I think now you have a parallel organization here. And I think it's also encouraging to see that the advisory keeps growing, and like the medal, which is the publication of PMS, that you will reach that level, which took them many years to reach, but to have a parallel magazine with, or journal with comparable articles, which I think in a nascent form exists now, but I think it will, you'll get to that point pretty soon. Hunting the Wild Aftercast. My talk will concentrate on how I became a collector, what I collected, and the whole sort of involvement with the medallic art, which did, as Skylar mentioned, result in 2 exhibitions, and actually a third one, which I will show you pictures of, which is at the Met.
Can you do it a little louder for us?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
We need microphones.
Do you have a mic?
No, don't have a mic. It all began when I was an undergraduate at Yale and read Jacob Burckhardt's famous Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, which was a Swiss historian. I should mention his nationality, which was published in 1830, I believe, 1860. And I was really thrilled by Burckhardt's presentation of the Renaissance, which was a seminal work that brought to people's attention the basic difference between Renaissance culture and medieval culture. And I'm a medievalist. Actually, my concentration is not really in metals, but in late medieval sculpture. And I was thrilled by his description of the people whom he dealt with from the Renaissance, and whom he brought to life in a very particular way. So when I was, do the next one. When I was traveling as an undergraduate in Italy for the first time, with Burckhardt in the back of my mind, and I was in Florence, and I was wandering along the Lungarno, and I saw an art dealer shop. And I wandered in because I was interested in art history, and asked the dealer if he could show me anything. And I have found over the years, and particularly as an early young collector, that dealers were very responsive to such questions. Whether you, as I appeared at the time, as a sort of rather shabby undergraduate, from whom he could not ever expect a sale, to later New York dealers who always welcomed me and who were very instructive. Anyway, he pulled out a few things, and one of them was a medal. And I don't remember what the medal was, but I sort of think it probably was Matteo de' Pasti's medal of Sigismondo Malatesta. It was a fairly common medal. And when I held it in my hand, it seemed to me a kind of electric connection with the past. The portrait of a man about whom Burckhardt had written extensively, Sigismondo Malatesta, and I felt this kind of connection, and that was the start of it. It was an object from that period. It showed a person from that period in a very distinctive and very attractive way. So during the rest of my travels in that time, at any museum that I visited, I looked to see their medal collection, the Cadoro, the Bargello, the Castello Sforzesca. Anywhere there was a decent collection of medals, I made it a point to see those collections. Well, I got back here and graduated and went on to the Institute of Fine Arts. And the Institute of Fine Arts, when I was at the Institute of Fine Arts, I took a course called museum training, which is now called curatorial studies. And part of that was a contest that they held among the students. You were supposed to go out and with $10 find an object and purchase it. This was in the mid-50s, so I don't remember exactly how much $10 really meant, but it wasn't a lot to buy a work of art. So we all went out and we bought our little works of art. And I found, I have the next one, I found a medal. It was also a contest, and that is that the person who was selected by the faculty as having purchased the best object was given their $10 back. Now actually with curatorial studies, it's a totally different system. You don't have to go out and buy something. You play the role of a curator, and you have to go out and find an object that is, this is inflation, $1,000, and you propose it to your fictive department. And then that's a contest too. I don't know what you win. You don't win the object, or you don't become a curator in the department, but you win that. So it's a little bit different. So what didn't win? The winner was a classic scholar who had a piece of Iznik pottery, and somehow or other that seemed to appeal to the faculty more than my little medal. I discovered later that, and this is, you can see from the title, this is a medal by Girolamo Paladino, who did papal reconstructions. I mean, he kind of reproduced medals based on real medals. And I don't have a picture of it here, but there is a real medal of Sixtus IV. And I only discovered this later, and as you can see also, it even has a die crack. So, but those are the kinds of things that happen to a young collector. At the same time, I took a course at the Institute in ancient art. There was a series of 3 courses given by Carl Lehmann on the 3 basic periods of Greek art. And I showed slides for him. I didn't take the course, actually. I showed slides for him. And he showed a picture of a griffin head, the griffin head handles on a cauldron. And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. So I went up to him after the course, and I said, after the class, and I said, can one find such a thing still to buy? And I was still a sort of impoverished student, but I asked him anyway. And he gave me the name of a dealer, and I went to see him, and it was a fellow by the name of Charles Morley, and he had changed his name. His father's name was Sigmund Morgenroth. And Sigmund Morgenroth had put together a really fabulous collection of Renaissance medals, which ended up in the University of California in Santa Barbara, and it's really worth a visit. I borrowed from that collection for Currency of Fame. So he didn't have any griffin heads, but he had, because of his father, he had coins and medals. And next one, please. And he had a group of Guillaume Dupré medals, and so I purchased this one. And that was the second medal that I ever bought. Then I did my master's thesis at the Institute on the medals in the collection of the Duc de Berry. And these, as you probably know, were seminal objects. They're rather difficult objects to understand, both the iconography and also their history. But they were, and I won't go into the history, it's rather complicated, but I was working then in the field of medals. But I went on with my doctorate to work on late medieval sculpture. During that time, I took the ANS summer seminar and did, you have the next one. Well, these are the 2, the Constantine and Heraclius medals are the 2 medals that survive from the collection of the Duc de Berry. And they are extremely important as being we think anyway, sources for the Italian Renaissance medal, because they were circulated. The Duke purchased them as objects of jewelry, really, mounted in jewels and hanging from a gold chain, but then he had them reproduced by his court artists, and that version of these medals then circulated. And certainly some of them ended up in Italy and were an inspiration for, you know who, Pisanello. But I took, during the time I was in the Institute, I took the A&S summer seminar, and I guess the next one, and did a paper on portraits in Renaissance coinage, because that too reflected the whole kind of approach, or the whole thesis that Burckhardt had presented of the emphasis on the individual and the individual's accomplishments in contrast to the medieval view of man. And that led to biography, to portraiture, and to particularly the medal. And once portraiture entered the world of numismatics, it also then became, of course, it really generated the medal itself. Then I went to Brown and taught there. Have the next one, please. And at Brown, there was, when I was a professor at Brown, we had a very close relationship to the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design. And every year around Christmas time, they had a project which was called Art for Your Collection. And the curators and some of the art historians in the Brown Art Department fanned out into the landscape and visited dealers to find objects which could be presented in the Art for Your Collection show for a Christmas purchase. It was a very good idea, and it stimulated a lot of very interesting activity. At that time, when I was sort of looking around for objects to contribute to this exhibition, I visited the Dry Gallery, and old Mrs. Dry showed me this medal, Pisanello's medal of Malatesta Novello, by another Malatesta. And so I borrowed it for the show. Not surprisingly, nobody bought it. And so I suggested to my family that wouldn't it be a nice acquisition. And I think a number of my early additions to the collection were due not to my finances, but to my parents' finances. And this was one of them. But it was a very important early purchase. Then, as a professor, I really did not have the means to collect medals, and so I wasn't collecting at that time, although still interested in it. It was only later, when I left academia to take over a family chemical manufacturing business, and I'm not going to go into that history because it's a rather interesting one, that I began to have the means to purchase medals, and did so to the extent that you probably are all aware of. And it was during that time that I mounted the two exhibitions that Skylar mentioned, the Currency of Fame, which was done for the Frick and the National Gallery in Washington, and also the National Gallery in Edinburgh, and sort of in honor of the Frick's director at that time, Charles Reiskamp, the Proud Republic, which was concentrated on medals of the Dutch Golden Age, which I've always found really fascinating for many reasons. During that time, even though I was running the chemical company, I gave lectures and published, and then was really collecting in a rather constant way. I also, at the same time, became head of the Soltis medal committee at the ANS, and it was there that I really became familiar with contemporary medals, with modern medals. And that brought up the whole question, which we're still sort of struggling with, of what is a medal? Because as modern and contemporary art has opened up the horizon, or opened up the limits of art, of visual art, so that affected the form of the metal, which no longer was necessarily a round object with two sides, but as you know, became many, many other different kinds of shapes and materials, which at times one had difficulty fitting in, as we deliberated about possible recipients of the saltless metal, what really happened to the definition of a metal, and so we would constantly raise the question of what is a metal, and that question is not answered. So I throw that out to you as something to think about. The next one, please. I guess an important thing to talk about are the criteria that I used for collecting. And I think the first thing was the quality of the design, that is, that the metal be a work of art. And with the exhibitions, also trying to present the metal as a piece of sculpture. That it was very important, and that goes back to the sort of blank look that people give me when I say I collect metals, that if its origins and its basic format exist in the world of numismatics, for me, it also exists as a very important element in the world of sculpture, even though the first major medalist, or even one could say the first medalist, Pisanello, was a painter. But I've always tried to emphasize or bring the metal into the world of I wouldn't say fine art, because we all think it's a fine art, but of the major arts, let's say, like sculpture and painting. And that has always been my first criterion. Then after that, of course, there's the question of condition and the other things that you would normally. But I never wanted to sort of complete a series or satisfy, let's say, a particular historical interest, but always just metal by metal, choosing what I felt was a really superior design, and in an example that was really first rate. And I chose this picture because there are many metals in the collection that fulfill those criteria, but it seemed to me that this is a really perfect example of a really beautiful. This is Jean Morin's medal of Anne of Austria with the child, Louis XIV, a child that she had desperately wished for and made a vow about, in terms of if she had a son, she would build and endow this monastery. And there is a kind of, the transmission of this important event, and here Louis is about 5 years old, the delicacy and beauty with which it's presented, and this extraordinary architectural reverse, to me represents in a way the kind of level of design quality and meaning that I always looked for. The next one. And inevitably one has to start with the perhaps greatest medalist of all time, and I don't really think that he's ever been matched, and that is Pisanello. And as many of you know, in 1438, when the Byzantine emperor was invited by the Pope to come to Italy and to try and effect a union of the two churches, the Eastern and the Western churches, there was a conference in Ferrara, and John VIII Palaeologus, who was the Byzantine emperor at the time, came to Ferrara and met with the Pope. And through some circumstances, they had the idea to commemorate this event. And at the same time, in town, a very major artist was working, and that was Antonio Pisano, who we call Pisanello. And he was given this commission And I think I have the medal. I own that medal, but I don't think I brought a picture of it. To commemorate it with some sort of a coin-like object, because here was a Roman emperor, and everyone was familiar with Roman coinage, and so they engaged Pisanello to make some sort of a similar object. Well, what he made was nothing like an ancient coin, but it became the model for all subsequent medals. This is one of his most beautiful, this medal of Cecilia Gonzaga. And as a painter, he was able, and this is another thing that is a bit of a mystery, is how this painter knew how to work in wax and to model objects such as this. And his presentation of the portrait of Cecilia, and then the complex and really beautiful iconography of the reverse, to me was something that was rarely ever matched. So I think one of the most stimulating aspects of medal collecting for me was portraiture, because I'd always been interested in portraiture, and that was the first reaction that I had when I saw the medal in Florence as an undergraduate, was the portrait of this person. And I think all types of portraiture, to me, it's a very complex and very fascinating subject. So it was something that really, as the basis of my collecting of medals. Next. The other characteristic is the historical evocation, the connection of the medal with historical events, with persons from the past, which would be not only the portrait but their particular contribution to history, or even if it's a very vague one, a representation of someone from a particular historical period. Next, please. I've been able, over the years, to find rather rare and distinctive objects, particularly ones that represent also the process of medal making. In this case, a wax model from the 16th century, and which is quite rare, and also because of its illustration of processes, that is particularly casting and striking, as we know, but the survival of an object such as this and its transmission from the model state into the finished medal, and also what happens between the two. And that brings up the whole question of connoisseurship, that is, how does one evaluate a medal? Because as a reproductive process, all sorts of things happen, and in that process and in the continuation of that process, and also how, and this would come up in terms of any kind of purchase, how it was presented by the person selling it. That is, if a numismatic language was used, and you all know the language of coin grading, whether that applied to medals or not, which it really doesn't, but what is the meaning of the word that I used in my title, an aftercast? The only real original is the wax model, or the stone model, or the wood model. Everything after that is really an aftercast. So the question is, what sort of example of a medal should you purchase? And that was always a difficult decision, because medals would come up all the time in numismatic auctions. They would be described with coin language, which was not really accurate, or they would be described in medallic language, which would be aftercast or later cast or modern cast or original, using the word original for a cast rather than a model. And navigating through this sort of language and through the actual examination of the piece, and whether it was whether it was of the period, a contemporary cast, or later, as with, let's say, Renaissance bronzes or with works on paper, that is prints, there was a whole process of comparison and of, as there is with diamonds too, the various categories of color and clarity and getting as close to the original concept of the artist as we, from a long distance, are able to do. The next one, please. This was particularly true with Dutch medals, which most of them were done by silversmiths and done in a particular technique that was very unique, but with results that were also quite striking and quite, no, I shouldn't use the word striking, but were quite impressive and very unusual. Most of these sorts of medals are made of two shells, we think cast shells that are then soldered together so that they're hollow inside. But it's the treatment of the portrait and the recording of all the events of the Dutch Golden Age that drew me to this type of medal. And it was for that reason that I did the exhibition, the Proud Republic. The next, please. Also, the range of medals that I was interested in, and it didn't have anything to do with material or size or country of origin. It was always a question of, was the design superior? And when you get to somebody like Saint-Gaudens, and you have reliefs such as these really are sculpture. I mean, it might be round, as in the case of his famous portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, or large portrait. Can't even call them plaquettes because they are large, but really extraordinary level of quality. And so that was another thing that was part of the decision making that I made as a medal collector. If we talk about portraits, the next please. If we talk about portraits, the approach to portraiture and the wide variety of types of portraits that, I mean, it is one of the most difficult, whether it's in photography or painting or sculpture or in medals, it's one of the most difficult subjects because you're trying to capture not only the physical features of your subject, but somehow something of the person's soul, something of the person's individuality beyond just their physiognomy. And I put these two together, which I find somewhat amusing, by Chaplin, a profile of a rather famous and beautiful woman, and then a more official, earlier German medal of a woman who, I'm afraid, in a beauty contest would have very little chance against Sarah Simon on her left. But it was the type of portrait, it was the what was conveyed by the portrait. I doubt, I mean, we probably can imagine that Sarah Simon looked like this, but I don't think that Elizabeth of Calenburg, we don't really get an idea of what she looked like. And yet she is presenting herself to the world through the hands of a medalist, and it ends up being, I think, a fascinating, can we call it a portrait? If we bumped into her in the street, I don't think we'd recognize her. Maybe the hat would do it. And the same is true for male portraits. Next, please. And there is the question also in a portrait of whether the subject is idealized or is shown realistically. And in German medals, the latter is usually the tendency, warts and all. You don't hold back. And you can see that here with this portrait of Ottheinrich van der Pfalz, who, once again, perhaps he should have met Elizabeth of Calenburg. They would have made an interesting couple. There is a little Hohenstone bust of Ottheinrich in the Louvre, or he's like this seated. It's about a half length, and he's seated, and it's very, very close to this. In fact, maybe by the same master, but in 3 dimensions. And there are other medals. There were some in Currency of Fame of German princes that are very, very realistic. And there you would have no doubt that you had bumped into Ottheinrich on the street. On the other side, on the, I guess it's your right, is attributed to Germain Pilon, one of the great Renaissance sculptors, French Renaissance sculptors of Henri II, based on drawings and paintings by Clouet, who was a court painter. And this also is very realistic, but in a very different way. It's not idealized. It brings out all of the sort of melancholy demeanor of Henry. But in both cases, they're very, very striking. And again, that word. You can't say very casting. I mean, they're very striking images and as portraits. And that was the kind of portrait. The whole subject of portraiture interested me through medals because of these approaches to this fascinating subject. The next one. Also, historical evocation, because many medals have nothing to do with portraits as the main objective, but record historical events. And one of the greatest medalists, and here we can use the word striking, to whom I became very, very much attracted, and whose work I collected rather assiduously, is Sebastian Dadler, who worked during the 30 Years' War and produced a lot of medals that recorded that terrible conflict. And I have always had the idea of doing an exhibition on medals of the 30 Years' War because it's conflicts like that. I mean, medals are produced for all kinds of events, but war seems to generate, because of the emotions involved, they seem to, and because of the purpose of medals, the fact that medals can be reproduced and circulated to a large public, often as propaganda, but usually, not usually, I suppose, often as well, just recording the events of that conflict, but from the point of view and with an emphasis on those who are producing it, that is, supporting their activities, supporting their point of view. And in the 30 Years' War, this is actually the end of it. It's celebrating the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War with the Emperor Ferdinand shown on the obverse. But it's the what can I call it? The expertise or the extraordinary talent of Sebastian Dadler. These are all struck, and they're all large, and they're all full of the most incredible detail, not overly crowded with detail, because that can ruin a composition, but somehow very, very giving you a very, very rich surface and also a very rich message, as you can see with this medal. And there's a lot there. Next, please. And of course, our favorite medal, something that you know about, and we've seen already on the poster, the Libertas Americana, which is part of a series, as you know, and also refers to historical events that are very important to us. In this case, and I don't know what you think about the Clodion-Dupré conflict, but anyway, sorry that Anne Poulet is not here because she could defend Clodion, but she seems to have fairly strong evidence. In any case, once again, historical evocation, a recording of historical events. And not only did portraiture always fascinate me, but also history itself, and to have these objects which record important events in history and are from that period and reflect a point of view or reflect an opinion or a particular emphasis that a government or a commissioner, the person who commissions the medal, wished to convey. To me, that was all fascinating. But first and foremost had to be the quality of the design. Because if you're if you're sending a message, you want that message sent in the best possible way. And if you're doing it visually, then it's up to the artist to not only transmit that message, but to transmit it in a way that, I hate to use the word beautiful, because often it's not beautiful. I think of another area that I've collected in, which is World War I medals, which is a fascinating field, and in particular the German medals from that period, which are very bitter.
Goats.
I mean, they're almost like cartoons in metal, particularly the medals of Karl Goertz, but also things like the Dance of Death and the German medals, which are often in iron, which is significant, were fascinating. And in contrast to the medals of the other countries, the Allied countries, which are more allegorical, which are it's a wonderful field. I don't need to dwell on it. Have the next, please. Another dawdler. No, this is Johann Blum. I'm sorry. Yeah, but a dawdlerian, if you will. Again, an extraordinary image, a very common image representing marriage. That is the couple shaking hands. But this presented at a level which, and there are many really quite beautiful marriage medals, but presented at a level that is still several notches higher than the average marriage medal. Next, please. Among the Dutch medals, and others too, but particularly among the Dutch medals, then you have the recording of ordinary life. You have the recording, and the Dutch were particularly, I mean, their production of art during the Golden Age, especially in painting, as we know, that painting was an obsession with the Dutch. I mean, everybody, including even a fairly humble person, would have paintings in their house. But they were also fascinated because of the glory of their history at that time, their maritime successes, their commercial successes, and their extraordinary wealth. They also were fascinated by medals and produced a design for almost every aspect of life, and in this case, death. And this also, I mean, these were silversmiths' works. You could go into a silversmith shop, you could say, Aunt Trudy has just died, and we need to have something to commemorate her death. And also, often these were given out to the pallbearers. And so they were produced with a blank space where you could put in. So this is a medal that's designed in the 17th century, but actually is given in the 18th century. It's still being circulated, but with marvelous imagery. And once again, the particular technique of the two shells soldered together. But it was really a commercial enterprise, but with results that always fascinated me. Next. Among the Italian medals, and I really began with Italian medals and then moved on to German, and then just opened the floodgates, and anything that interested me and that I saw, mostly in numismatic auctions, because the medal continues to exist in the world of numismatics. It's where it grew out of, and that's where it still exists, and that's where you find, as you all know, you find medals for sale. Very, very rarely do you find medals at the major auction houses. Sotheby's, for a while, under the leadership of Tom Eden, who was co-head of their numismatics department, which they then shut down, had the ability to find entire collections that he brought to Sotheby's and sold, and those days seem to be past. But other types of imagery, like this fascinating medal from Reggio Emilia, an area where in the 16th century medals were produced usually in pewter or lead, more likely lead, but with a range of imagery that was very different and fascinating. And this is one of the most unusual and puzzling medals that that school produced. Still hard to explain. Very much an emphasis on classical antiquity. I mean, this woman whose identity is not known. A lot of their medals were portraits, but also cast in, and there I use the word cast, but it's true, cast in a kind of classical environment, so to speak. The women would be represented as maybe ancient goddesses, or one of the artists even has a medal, Bombarda has a medal of his own wife, where she's naked to the waist down, because it's a connection with classical antiquity. In this case, and this was a medal that I had always hungered for, and was in currency of fame with a different owner, and then eventually ended up at auction, and I purchased it, which is things that can happen. You have to have patience in this world. But this was one of the most fascinating because, one, we don't know who she is, probably not an actual individual, but two, because of the little face that looks in from the right. The only other thing that I've seen like that is a painting at the Met by Filippo Lippi of a portrait of a woman with her fiance's head looking in. But this is not that. And this has always been called a kind of vanitas image, where this beautiful woman, armless and as a classical bust, is looking at this head. And it was always thought that the head was that of an old woman and that this was a vanitas image. But when I look very, very closely, and you can see perhaps just below the chin of the face looking in, which is certainly an aged person, there is a little sort of color, and I really believe it's the head of a man, not a woman. In any case, it's one of those puzzles that's really fascinating to try to untangle, but also an extraordinarily beautiful piece. And that's always, for me, the beginning and the end. Next, please. Well, sometimes there's a medalist who produces a tour de force that nobody ever imitates again. And this is another extremely important German medalist, Hans Reinhardt, whose works are all cast, in contrast to Dodler. Reinhardt is earlier, he's part of the German Renaissance. And he makes many really quite beautiful portraits of the current rulers, Charles V, his brother Ferdinand, Johann Friedrich of Saxony, but he produces this. It's during the Reformation, which is the so-called Trinity Medal, and it's really a tour de force, and is actually the work of a silver. I mean, it's really more the work of a silversmith. And the scepter and the crucifix itself were cast separately and are soldered on. It's a relatively rare medal, an expensive medal, a large medal like this, but it is really unique. I don't think there's anything like it. It's an extraordinary thing. Next, please. Well, if one has medals at home, one doesn't have to worry much about exhibiting them, depending on your home, I suppose. You either have it in safety deposit boxes or in a safe, but you don't want to leave it there. You want to look at your things. And also you want to show them to people. And the best way to do that is, of course, with a public exhibition. But then you encounter the difficulty of exhibiting this kind of object. And it's probably, from a museum point of view, one of the most difficult objects to exhibit. It's small, it's monochromatic, it's detailed, and God forbid it has two sides. So how do you do it? And the normal way is the way you see here at the Bode Museum, which has an extraordinary collection, where unfortunately you only see one side. And one of the most difficult problems of medal exhibitions is lighting too. And it's very, very rare to see a good installation in a museum. I'm showing just a few. This is another kind of installation where you show some things and you have the rest of the collection in drawers. You can find this at the Louvre. The next, please. And this has become, well, on the left is one way of exhibiting, which is to have a lucite sheet and then have the medals. And there you can see both sides, except then you have those medals which are oriented in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
That is what we call 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And then you have to have all of your viewers sort of going like this all the time when they're trying to see the other side. What we did for Currency of Fame was, whenever possible, to borrow two examples and to try in that way to show both of them. And the designers who were from the National Gallery in Washington really did a terrific job. The Met, which is on the right, has developed these little wires and then a half moon holder to show both sides of the medal. And those are not bad. We call them lollipops. They're not so bad, but one, you're not solving the reversed axis, and two, as you can see, when you try and light it, you have all these little shadows on the base, and that's distracting. Next, please. This is a little exhibition that I've just done at the Met of medals from the Lehman collection. And there, once again, their obsession is with these lollipops. But their lighting, they've got it just right. And it's because the ceilings are relatively low, and somehow they were able to light at the correct angle, and they really, really bring out the surface beautifully, as you can see. You still have those shadows, and I think that the lollipops are too tall, but it is one solution. Next, please. So I'm just very quickly going to run through a few of examples of areas of the collection, key pieces that I thought you might like to see, and showing the range of the collection, and also I hope that you'll agree with the quality is good. This is one of the very earliest French medals, the Medal of Louis XII and of Bretagne, which is a kind of fusion of some Gothic elements and Renaissance, which comes in through Lyon, with Lyon being a kind of crossroads of Italian and French culture. Next. And also famous, or let's say very important rather, Italian medalists, such as Niccolo Fiorentino, with a connection with France, because with the French invasion in 1494, they want medals of the participants, and so this is, and this is really honest portraiture. This is Charles VIII, who was not anyone's idea of a Prince Charming, but Niccolo's portraits are they're high relief and they're very strong. His reverses, and that's another thing, when we saw Pisanello's reverses, they're very eloquent, they're very beautifully designed and beautifully executed. People like, and we'll see another one, not yet, Sperandillo and Niccolo Fiorentino, their portraits are wonderful. They're high relief and very strong. Somehow they fall off on the reverses, and some of the reverses are copied from Pisanello, and you see the difference. They're a little bit on the clumsy side. Next. Another important area is Nini, who is an Italian working in France and produces these large terracotta medallions, which I've also found to be really quite handsome. And this, somehow or other, I have to say that I've always been more attracted to medals of women than of men, because somehow they always seem to be more, I don't know, more sensitive, more beautiful, I guess. I don't know what it is. But this is a good example of Nini's work, which is, I have a few of Nini's works. Next, please. Among the earliest German medalists was Hans Schwarz, who began producing medals for the Diet that occurred in 1518 in Augsburg. And this is an example of his work, which is very strong, cast probably from a wax model, but the Germans generally thereafter made their medals from wood and stone models. And I may have a slide of that, I don't know. And many of more of those survive because, of course, wax models would be rather delicate. I was going to say something else about this medal. Oh, yes. Well, it was interesting because this came up at Sotheby's in an auction of a rather important German collection. And it was lot number 5, and somehow or other, it was passed over. I mean, I could never, ever understand it. And so I bought it in a post-auction sale. And it's really an extremely important and very, very handsome piece. I've always asked myself, am I missing something? I mean, does everybody else think it's a later cast or whatever? But it's exactly the same kind of fabric that his early medals have. It's kind of rough in fabric. Next, please. And then there is the, well, on the left, the whole revival of the cast medal, or in this case plaquette, but the cast, whatever, in France in the 19th century. It was a very important moment, beginning with David d'Angers and his whole series of important people of his era, a series of 500 large medallions. And that leads to, because there's a revival of sculpture in 19th century France, and that leads to a revival also of the cast medal. And many, many quite beautiful products come out of that period. And that too interested me greatly, and I put together a fairly decent group. Or on the right, this gold centennial medal. I guess it's a centennial medal. No, I guess it's a sesquicentennial medal.
60th anniversary.
60th, right, and it was one of them, of Victoria, having the old Victoria on one side and the young Victoria on the other. And there again, there's a kind of revival of the medallic art, although English medallic art, for the most part, was quite productive early on with foreign artists and then with native artists. But this also represents a quite beautiful portrait, I think. And the next, please. Or series of medals that in a way sort of begin in Italy with Cosimo I, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who does a series of medals of the historical events of his period or of his reign. And then Louis XIV, whose Histoire métallique is well known, often rather tedious, but still a kind of recording of all the events of his reign. I think when he blew his nose, they struck a medal. And then going on to Napoleon, where once again you have artists who are both mundane, rather ordinary, or artists such as, and the obverse, which is by Andrieux, who did the sort of official portrait of Napoleon. But then you had a series of other artists who did the reverses. And Brenet was one of the most inventive. And this particular medal of the École des Mines at Mont Blanc is a particularly wonderful image. So that's also the kind of thing that, let's say if you have a whole series of medals, I would really only pick things that had images such as this. And the next. And there was a very important collection of Venetian medals by Voltolina, a collection put together by Voltolina, who published an entire history of Venice in medals, but also had a very large sale. And so there are medals such as this, obviously meant to be worn, but once again of a character and a beauty which attracted me. Next. So in a way, we come back to the beginning of things, which is Pisanello. And I find him to be the beginning and the end. This is Leonello d'Este's marriage medal. And once again, like the Cecilia medal, having a reverse, an eloquent and extraordinarily imaginative representation of this event, the marriage of the prince. And Leonello, as you know, if you know Italian, means little lion. And even his particular hairdo is leonine. But Pisanello has taken this event and turned it into an extraordinarily poetic image of a lion, this fierce beast, being taught to sing by Cupid. And in the background you have one of the heraldic devices of the Este family, the eagle, but all incorporated in this extraordinary subtle relief. But and do we know that it was Pisanello who dreamed up this iconography? It may have been Leonello himself, because he was a very accomplished humanist. Nonetheless, it was Pisanello who made it, and we have to sort of think that since most of his other medals have equally imaginative and poetic and beautiful reverses, that it was he who did this. And we'll always look for another Pisanello. I mean, another artist like Pisanello. But we'll also look for Pisanellos. He did about, or let's say about 23 medals of his survive in terms of models. There are others he did, we know from documents, but the ones that he did do will always be at the top of the list. Thank you.
Great job.